Um, so the final thoughts here. Macbeth is defeated. There is this kind of odd sort of staging issue around Macbeth's um, death and then his beheading, which happens off stage. Um, but the tyrant has been slain, and Malcolm is going to be who was, you remember, he was the Prince of Cumberland. He was the designated heir of Duncan, and so Macbeth is basically going to be kind of cut out of history as this kind of aberration. And the continuity of Duncan to Malcolm, to Malcolm, that's going to be the the restoring of um, things to their normal functioning. Um, so Malcolm gets the last words of the tragedy. This is Act 5, Scene 8, around line 60. Um, and I mean, there's not much to say here. I mean, on the one hand, right, he sounds a lot like his father. He says, he wants to. Uh, we shall not spend a large, expensive time before we reckon with your several loves and make us even with you, right? And you recall that's what the first thing that Duncan said when he encounters Macbeth after Macbeth has gotten rid of the rebels in at the very, like, basically before the play begins. But in Act 1, Scene 4, that's what Duncan wants to do, is to kind of recompense Macbeth. My thanes and kinsmen henceforth be earls, the first that ever Scotland in such honor named. And that's kind of like a small little point, but there's this kind of idea of anglicizing Scotland at this point, and that's another kind of contemporary reference. What's more to do, which will be planted newly with the time, as calling home our exiled friends abroad that fled the snares of watchful tyranny, producing forth the cruel ministers of this dead butcher and his fiend-like queen, who, as 'tis thought, by self and violent hands took off her life. This, and what needful else that calls upon us by the grace of grace, we will perform in measure, time, and place. Thanks to all at once and to each one whom we invite to see us crowned at Scone, right? So now you're going to have a guy who is going to be sort of ruling again by norms, by the conventions of things. And that's the idea of kind of undoing that tyranny and of restoring England, or restoring Scotland to its to its rightful and proper function of things. That perform in measure, time, and place has a very sort of, what is the decorum, what are the conventions, what can we do to return Scotland to its normal way of operation and so on. Okay, so that's all I have to say about Macbeth at this point. I mean, there's a ton more that we could do with the play, right? I mean, I didn't do enough probably with thinking about um, the witches and the question of free will and providence. I mean, I do think that those are interesting questions in the play. Um, does Macbeth have a choice in what he's doing? Once you start kind of thinking in those terms of providence and free will and so on, that is a tricky and fascinating question. I don't know if there's a really good answer to it in the play. I think that the play sort of points in both directions. I think that the question of nature and what is meant by nature in this play is a really fascinating one. We've touched on it a couple times around the idea of natural hierarchies, around the idea of nature as referring to character and personality, nature in terms of just environment and eco-critical kinds of readings of nature, and then the questions of what is not nature, like the supernatural or the unnatural. I mean, I think that that is a really fascinating aspect of the tragedy as well. So I mean, there's a lot to see in this play. For me, I focus mostly on just the politics of the play. That's the kind of thing that usually interests me the most. But I mean, there's a lot more that we could do with this play. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording